Now let's start with the basics. And if you already know how to dress properly, you can skip this part. But despite how beautiful you are, your garage isn't a catwalk, and you've got to dress for hard work. And the basic rule is, if you wouldn't wear it around an unprotected blender at full speed, don't wear it near a spinning blade. For starters, you shouldn't have any long sleeves or gloves, as any piece of fabric accidentally caught in the blade will pull it in. And I promise you, in a fight between your fingers and this blade, you stand no chance. So throw these away and make sure you don't have any flappy clothing. Because as you're pushing something through here, if it accidentally cuts it, it's going to do the same. And it's not going to be a nice outcome. And so make sure that nothing is flapping about. Same with wedding rings or watches or any piece of jewelry. Whatever gets caught in that blade, sadly will be pulled in. And I know, you're really careful and you're really not that dumb. But let's be honest here. Sometimes we all are that dumb. But sadly, one time is enough to make sure that the only thing you can do with your hand is to make a fist. And as my friend says, check yourself before you wreck yourself. Or something like that. Anyway, if you had one of those unfortunate situations, let us know in the comments below. Now, table saws, they're actually a lot like toddlers. They're really loud and they throw stuff everywhere. If you want to hear your grandkid complain when you're old and not have to breathe through one of these, then you gotta protect your eyes, ears and lungs. And I personally recommend a proper dust mask or at least one of these. You see, even if you have a really good vacuum hooked up, you will still be breathing a lot of dust particles, which you probably won't be able to see. But they will be there, covering your lungs. And tiny sawdust is a lot like hemorrhoids. You may not be able to see them, but they will be a huge pain in the ass. That was such a bad joke. And same goes for your ears. I mean, this thing is loud. In fact, it's as loud as a toddler screaming right into your ears. And I recommend to do the same for both. To get yourself one of these, or one of the big ones that I need to buy as well. And of course, remember to put those on, just in case. So, before you actually turn this thing on, you gotta check a couple of things to make sure that you won't make your life any more difficult than it probably needs to be. First things first, make sure that your blade is at 90 degrees to the bed itself. Ideally, you should make sure that your saw says 0 degrees here, which is corresponding to the 90 degrees of that blade. Next, you gotta make sure that your rib fence is square to the blade. And you can do that by grabbing a speed square and making sure that your rib fence is the same distance from the blade on both sides. And if you want to be fancy and far more accurate, you can use a clock gauge. In my case, it's 3D printed. I just slot it in and pretty much check on both sides that it is correct. And if not, you need to adjust it. And just as important, before you make a cut, make sure that nothing is wobbling or moving, whether that's a rib fence or the blade itself or any other parts around here. And these might seem trivial, but having a misaligned blade or loose rib fence is one of the best ways to ensure that you have a poor quality cut at best and a projectile made from wood at worst. Now, I'm sure that you've already seen some footage of a kickback, and it's pretty much a piece of wood that's been shot out at 100 miles per hour straight into someone's nuts. And while it might seem funny when it happens to someone else, not so much when it happens to you. You see, when you're cutting a piece of wood, what can actually happen is that in the middle of a cut, as your wood is releasing some of the stresses, it can actually bend inwards and pretty much clamp onto that blade. And as you can imagine, with this blade spinning really fast, this blade will pretty much grab onto this piece of wood and eject it at a very high speed in this direction, straight into your stomach, which will hurt quite a lot. But there's a couple of things that you can actually do to prevent this. For starters, always use this little thing, the riving knife. Its job is literally to save you. And it does a pretty good job at that. And it works by simply being here and being wider than the blade itself, which pretty much prevents your wood from clamping onto the blade itself. If anything, it will clamp onto the riving knife and it will be actually quite difficult to push it forward. If that happens, don't force it. And by the way, if you ever experience a serious kickback, go to an emergency room and check for any internal bleeding, because that stuff can literally kill you. And also, as a safety precaution, never stand between the blade and the rib fence. And make sure to always stand on the other side of your blade from the rib fence. So you can imagine that anything here is pretty much the danger zone. If you ever enjoyed a kickback or know someone that does, drop it in the comments below. Let's learn from our mistakes. Whenever you want to make a cut, one of the last things you want to do is pretty much this. Having this blade this high makes absolutely no sense. And you need to make sure that your blade doesn't come any higher than it actually needs to. And just to be a lot more specific, the blade should only be coming out a tiny bit above the actual piece of wood. It doesn't make sense for your blade to be any higher than that. And in fact, it can be really dangerous. Effectively, if your hand accidentally slips for whatever reason as you're pushing it, you will likely lose the tips of your fingers. But you will still have your fingers. And that's a win. And ideally, you should be using a full blade guard, so that if your hand actually slips for whatever reason, you can't get your hand in there. And I know this thing is not really sexy and can be frustrating to use, but it can make it a lot safer. And also, I haven't really mentioned it yet, but whenever you're changing anything like a riving knife or whatever else, make sure to unplug your saw. Your saw blade is very much like a really attractive person holding a taser. It's nice to look at. You should really keep your hands to yourself. Anytime you're cutting anything, you should be using a push stick. And not just for the last inch, but for the most of your cut. And so what I typically do is I use my push stick to make sure that my piece of wood is actually always right against the rib fence. Pretty much holding it here as I'm pushing my wood through, making sure that it doesn't go anywhere close to the actual blade. And then as I'm getting pretty much to the end, I switch my hand with the actual push stick and I push it through. And this way, at no point my hand gets anywhere close to this little devil. But of course, as you're pushing it, make sure that you're using your push stick correctly. Specifically, pushing it in a way that won't accidentally rotate the piece itself. For example, if you push it right where that blade is, there is a chance that actually this will happen. You will slightly rotate it, and if you're lucky, it will be a bad cut. If you're unlucky, it's gonna be worse. What I typically do is I push it about 2 to 3 centimeters to the right from that blade. So pretty much somewhere here. And if for whatever reason you haven't actually got a push stick, you can make one really easily. Just get one of your many offcuts and you can pretty much just make a 90-degree angle like you can see here. And also, you should probably consider getting one of those expensive push blocks. I mean, they seem to be pretty safe. But if you're anything like me, then you probably haven't got the money for that. And so, at least make sure to always use your push stick. Now, one of the key things to remember is that whatever you're cutting should always be parallel to your table saw. Make sure to never start your cut like this, or for whatever reason, finish like that. If your piece is longer than your table saw, it should always be supported on the other side like it is with the table here. Also, with very long pieces, you should really make sure that as you're cutting it, it is parallel to the rib fence, because you can very easily push it at an angle if you're holding it here, and that can be dangerous. And so what I suggest is to hold it more or less here, and as I mentioned in the past, just push it like that. And if you need to move your hand, you can pretty much hold it with a push stick and then move your hand and continue that move. But if for whatever reason it does actually happen, and you can see that as you're pushing it through, it is at an angle, never pull it back. Pretty much what you need to do in that moment is to hold it down and hit an emergency button. Do not move it back, don't try to fix it, just stop it. Then if you can, make an entire cut again, but never move it back. Another thing to remember is that you should never cut warp boards, pretty much ones that are rocking from side to side. Because what pretty much will happen is that as you're cutting it, that side will slightly switch and it might bind onto the blade itself. And you more or less know what will happen then. What you can do is pretty much to flip it, and if the other way is fine, then you can make your cut. But if it's not, then it's not worth it. Okay, so here's a classic beginner move, and I think all of us have been dumb enough to try this at some point. Let's use a miter gauge to guide the crosscut and then use the rib fence as my distance. And in your head, it seems like a great idea. And it is. If what you want to do is die. Don't ever do this. What this effectively does is as you made your cut, it traps this piece between 2 fixed points, and it can then very easily twist. And then you know what will happen. It will hit you right in the baby maker. From those two, you should always be using one at a time. And I think in most cases, your gut will pretty much tell you which one it is. For example, you would never really make a cut like that, because the chances of it twisting are just far too high. For any cut like that, just use the miter gauge. I mean, it's literally there for that reason. And ideally, you should make a cross-cutting sled, which can be incredibly useful. But if you're anything like me, it would take you a good while to actually find the time to do it. And what I did instead, I took my miter gauge and offcut and just made this monstrosity. And it's okay, it does the job. And it took me no more than 5 minutes to make, which is kind of nice. Every so often, you will need to cut a very thin piece of wood like this one. But I'll be honest with you, cutting it here with very little space in between the blade and the rib fence is asking for trouble. I mean, you can do it of course, but the chances are what will actually happen is that this very light and thin piece here, pretty much at the end of your cut, will likely become loose, grab onto that blade, and at an impressive speed, impale that wall behind me. I don't recommend it. But if you do actually need a very thin piece of wood, what I recommend instead is to do this. Is to grab yourself a much wider piece of wood, then set your distance on this side of the blade and then push your cut through. And you will get that piece, but without having to worry about your safety. The same goes for making cuts for long pieces of wood like this one. You should never push it through like that. But if you do need to make that cut, I know there are various jigs to do this safely, but in general I wouldn't recommend it. What I recommend instead, for example, if you need to do a half lap joint, is to grab yourself a miter gauge and just do it over many cuts. It's much safer that way. You can of course also just grab a pull saw and just do it by hand. Sometimes you may want to cut very tall pieces like this. And what you can actually do is to set your blade height to about 45% of the height of that piece, pretty much push it through, then twist it like this, and push it through again. And then you'll be left with this tiny little thing holding it in the middle, and you can grab a pull saw or anything else and just cut it right off. And doing it this way is much safer than cutting it fully in 2 passes. Now, here's my last main point. If it feels sketchy, it probably is. If you're doing something, making a cut, and are kind of eyeballing that emergency stop, thinking to yourself, yeah, it probably will be fine, then it won't. I mean, just hit that emergency button, take 2 minutes to think about what you're trying to do and whether that's the right approach, and then do it again. I mean, your pride is just not worth the stitches. And let's face it, there's usually a lot of these moments. Let's say you're making a cut and there is something there, there's an offcut or a pencil or whatever, and you're thinking to yourself, I might just reach over the blade. And that's always a bad idea. Just turn it off, wait for it to stop, and then do what you wanted to do. Or if you're making a cut and you feel that you have to push way too hard to actually cut it. And you're probably right. You should stop, clean your blade, make sure everything is tight, and then push it through again. In general, your gut will tell you a lot about how to keep you safe, and you should really listen to it. Okay, so let's recap. You should dress smart, protect your eyes, ears and lungs. Make sure to calibrate your saw. You should avoid kickback at all costs. Always use a push stick. You should support longboards. Never use a miter gauge and whip fence together. Always have a plan for awkward cuts and trust your gut. If it feels sketchy, it probably is. Now, if you learned something or just simply appreciate having fingers, drop this video a like. And if you'd like to get any of the items shown in this video, there are affiliate links below. It doesn't cost you anything, but you're supporting this channel by using them. Make sure to subscribe. And hey, what's the sketchiest thing that you've done on a table saw? No judgment. We've all done pretty dumb stuff.